patience as we work through getting members to the floor. Sorry we couldn't keep it going as continuously as we hoped we would, but at least we limited the disruption. If I can, now we'll go to my good friend, the ranking member, for any questions he cares to offer.
Thank you again, Chair. Mr. Secretary, the chairman asked about what happens if we have a CR and what impact that has. My friend, the ranking member of the full committee, talked about what those cuts might mean if we're at 20% to particularly rail safety. I guess what's left is, if we're at 20%, what does that do to how you prioritize system safety beyond just rail, and what it means to transportation as a whole?
We're a safety agency, and everything we do is prioritized first and foremost around safety, and that also means that when our activities are cut or suspended or impacted by some of these issues, that affects our ability to meet our safety mission. If we think about the aviation side of that, for example, we'd be looking at a hiring freeze, in effect, for our whole operations and facilities workforce. That includes controllers, includes safety inspectors, and there's some experience of this in the past from moments like the 2013 sequester. That was just a 5% reduction and led to furloughs, which, of course, are going to have an impact. If we were, we talked about rail, I would point to our Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA. I don't see how they could conduct the current pace of field inspections with those kinds of cuts. In fact, we estimate about 2,000 fewer days would be dedicated to inspecting hazardous liquid and natural gas pipeline facilities and LNG export facilities, as well as a diminished ability to respond to hazmat incidents, which they often do. For example, while I think it's widely known that Federal Rail Administration personnel were on the ground within hours in East Palestine, I'm not sure everyone is aware that PHMSA personnel were there too. These are the kinds of activities that could be impacted. There would be a reduced workforce and hiring freeze at NHTSA, which of course makes sure that our vehicles are safe. Transit would be affected. There's no part of our transportation system or our safety mission that I don't think we'd be touched in some way by these levels of cuts.
Delve a little deeper on PHMSA and just what resources are necessary, and forget the issue of cuts. In a perfect world, what is it that we need? What numbers do we need to get to enhance rail safety to the point where it's never going to be foolproof, but we can help overcome the numbers that we're facing now?
Well, for PHMSA, we're requesting $387.3 million and 690 positions, and that is spread across pipeline safety, hazardous material safety, emergency preparedness grants, and that's another area I would say comes into play often when you have incidents like what happened in East Palestine, because we found that many of the first responders who were involved in that response had been trained thanks to federally funded PHMSA programming. And then, of course, you have the FRA side of the house, which is seeking funding that would allow FRA to continue to expand and develop its safety programs. Since arriving, this administration established a process of doing detailed safety audits on individual railroads to check for compliance issues. And that kind of proactive work is something we would love to be able to do more of, even within the authorities we have. Provided we have appropriate staffing. Then, as I mentioned in my testimony, of course, we're also interested in further authorities that might come by way of the bipartisan dialogue right now about rail safety legislation.
And where are rail partners at with this, with what their responsibilities are and what they still need to do?
Well, I think they could be doing a lot more, and I've called on them to do a lot more. I will say, after I called on them to participate, for example, in the confidential close call reporting system, which enables whistleblowers at railroad companies to identify safety issues without fear of reprisal, they did respond, and all 7 of the Class 1 railroads committed to join that program. So that's a step that I do want to recognize. But we would like to see a lot more. For example, more proactive work to notify communities when hazardous materials are coming into their jurisdictions aboard freight trains. And while we will continue calling on industry to do the right thing, I think ultimately, rather than merely asking, we need to make sure we have the right combination of legislation and enforcement activity to compel them to do the right thing.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We'll next go to my good friend from Florida, Representative Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. Great to see you. Sir, I'd like to bring up an issue that's very near and dear to many people around the country. These front-over accidents, I've heard from concerned constituents in my district, and I'm sure every district across America. These front-overs are usually accidents that occur at a very low speed, usually in parking lots, driveways, and they always involve pedestrians. It's my understanding that NHTSA reports on non-traffic accidents such as these that occur in driveways, parking lots, or private roads. In their non-traffic report from 2016 to 2020, they noted that 386 pedestrians are killed every year by a forward-moving vehicle in a non-traffic setting. And that's concerning. I know there's some efforts out there that the vehicle manufacturers can take. Is the Department of Transportation working with the auto industry at all on technology that could reduce the occurrence of these front-overs? And would DOT benefit from collecting additional information on this from these non-traffic accidents, such as their setting and what causes them? You know, you see some of these new trucks, they set so high, small child sitting in front of that vehicle, they get in from the back, the driver gets in from the back, doesn't see the child, runs right over them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and thanks for the chance to address this safety concern. It's something that is mounting, especially as the typical privately owned vehicle gets larger across America. We need to make sure that each passing year our vehicles are safer than they used to be. I would point to two lines of effort that I think are responsive to the concern you're raising. One has to do with continued data research and rulemaking on technologies like automatic AEB and the braking that goes with that, and just the visibility that can be created through sensors, cameras, and other technology. Often they first arrive in the fleet as relatively new and sometimes even untested technology, but quickly can be demonstrated to be something that's got such life-saving potential that it ought to be made a requirement so that whether you have access to it doesn't depend on whether you can afford that particular bell or whistle because it's standard. The second thing I would point to is a shift in how we're thinking about the new car assessment program. Traditionally, it was confined to the safety of the occupants. And of course, we're very concerned about the safety of the occupants of a vehicle. That's why seatbelts, airbags, and a whole lot more is evaluated. We've reached the point where we also need to be paying attention to how the design of a vehicle has implications for the safety of those who are outside of it. And that's something that you will see more of, I think, in the years to come as NHTSA develops its next steps for the NCAP program.
All right. Thank you very much. And I'll be interested in following that. Having worked the backups before we had the backup cameras, remember that? I want to bring up the issue of Buy America. I'm hearing from many of my constituents back home, if they're applying for the grants, the infrastructure grants from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the challenge that they have, look, everybody wants to spend our hard-earned tax dollars and their money on American-made. But some of these regulations, I understand that there's lack of clarity surrounding the implementation of the Buy America requirements, causing a lot of confusion among state departments of transportation, local governments, and contractors. I've also heard that these new expanded Buy America standards could actually stall our infrastructure development because a lot of the materials that we need, like aggregates, concrete, asphalt, can't meet, the American resources can't meet those requirements. What is DOT doing to provide information to the various stakeholders, first of all? And just as important, can you assure the subcommittee that the implementation of the Buy America requirements will be done in a way that does not increase project cost and on top of the inflation-related costs that we're already seeing, and does not result in these projects being delayed, because you know how quickly we need to get them to fruition.
So we're very focused on making sure that these projects are delivered on time and affordably, and recognize that there's a balance between our strong commitment that begins with the president to make sure that American taxpayer dollars buy American goods and American materials, and making this a process that our project sponsors find manageable. And in some cases, there will be growing pains as well, because we're seeking to stimulate more of a domestic industry, but it's not fully there yet. Our intention is to be as transparent and clear as possible about this guidance. So my hope is that the new Q&A information that Federal Highways put out a few weeks ago, as well as a further push on communication, will be responsive to some of the concerns that you're mentioning. But this is certainly something we hear about as we talk with state DOTs. And without watering down our commitment to Buy America, we do want to make sure that this is as user-friendly a process as we can make it for our project sponsors, and that there's a common sense factor applied as well.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I see my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I recognize my good friend from California, Mr. Aguilar, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. You've consistently highlighted the need to combat transportation-related emissions, including those related to transit and buses. This is demonstrated in the President's budget request, which includes $1.1 billion for low and no emission vehicle programs to help transit agencies modernize their fleets. Reducing transportation-related emissions is important for my district, right next door to my colleague here, Ms. Torres, as you visited us in the past. We have some of the worst air pollution in the nation, and we want to see this significantly changed, and we know that low and no emission programs is an important part of that. Mr. Secretary, how would, first of all, just I guess from a broader perspective, how would the funding levels, if we were to reduce this program to FY22 levels in the low and no emission program, impact underserved communities like ours that continue to suffer from air pollution?
Well, we know that an investment in low and no emissions buses is an investment in economic empowerment for the people who will ride it, clean air for the people who live around those routes, and of course, an investment toward our national climate goals. I'll follow up to get the numbers on the impact that would come with that. What I can tell you is that we would be well short of what we're asking for here. There are advance appropriations that are part of the picture for the low-no program, but our total request is $1.1 billion. And I can tell you that every penny of that is going to be sought after by project sponsors based on the experience that we had in our first round. We got 530 eligible project applications in fiscal 22 for $7.7 billion worth of purchases. We were able to fund 1.5 of that. So we know that there is enormous interest here and demand. And any cut to that would just mean we would have to turn away that many more worthy and eligible applicants.
I also wanted to highlight that San Bernardino County, where I live, has experienced positive impacts from this program. Our local transit agency has been working toward a goal of 100% zero-emission fleet by 2040, and in August received $9 million in funding from the low and no emission vehicle program in order to buy 4 hydrogen fuel cells to add to its fleet, as well as partnering with apprenticeship programs at the local community college to make sure that we can maintain that. I think it's a worthy endeavor, and they're making significant progress. Also wanted to stay with the West and talk climate in California. We know over the last several years, California's experienced extreme weather conditions and most recently atmospheric storms and flooding. The administration's highlighted the growth in extreme weather and climate-related disasters from the perspective of having more resilient transportation infrastructure. Can you talk about the work that your agency is doing, the department is doing in taking advanced construction of more resilient transportation projects?
Thank you for the question. We're within a few days of announcing the notice of funding opportunity for the PROTECT program, which is one of the, I think, most novel and timely programs included in the IIJA. It allows us to fund and support projects that seek to make infrastructure more resilient because, as you noted, these extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more severe. And from wildfires to droughts to floods to mudslides, they are impacting our infrastructure, certainly in California and every part of the country. This is also something, of course, that's not just confined to our PROTECT program, but it's the first of its kind in terms of being dedicated for that. We also make sure that where appropriate statutorily, we're integrating resilience considerations as we evaluate various applications that come in. Just to give one example, sometimes a road project will be able to demonstrate that it's of particular significance as an evacuation route, and that's something that we would want to take account of.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. And on behalf of our region, and also want to thank you for the grant opportunities that you've sent our way. We very much appreciate it. We work as a region in Southern California. We often say that my constituents might work in Norma Torres's district and go to church in another district. Folks, the work that the transit agencies do and that we have from a mobility perspective is so important in making sure that people can get to where they need to be. Thank you for your efforts and your leadership, and good to see you again.
Likewise.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We'll go to another of my great friends from California, Mr. Valadeo, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for making the time for us today. I really appreciate your time. The Central Valley is one of the highest producing agriculture regions in the world. Yet, due to ongoing supply chain issues, particularly at California's ports, our farmers and ranchers are struggling to get their products to foreign markets. While it's gotten a little bit better, it still continues to be a problem for us. Can you give us any update on what the DOT is doing to make these problems a little bit easier for us? And can you tell me about the coordination between the Department of Transportation and USDA as it relates to ag products facing those delays? Is there any prioritization for perishable goods?
Well, thank you for the question, and the short answer is yes, we're working closely with USDA. I would note, for example, that during the most acute periods of these backups, we were able to team up with them on helping make these what are called pop-up ports or container yards available that facilitated a more fluid movement for agricultural exports. And we recognize that while most of the supply chain stories are covered in the media in terms of electronics coming in from Asia, the issue of American goods being exported is a very important dimension of this. It's one of the reasons why we're investing so much in port infrastructure generally, and the President's budget includes a robust request on top of the advanced appropriations for PIDP. And I know that many of the applications that come in for that program would benefit the agricultural export fluidity in the long run. In the shorter run, I also appreciate the chance to mention a program of ours called FLOW, Freight Logistics Optimization Works. This is a voluntary program where we brought in a number of players from across the sector, retailers, ports, anybody who we think has data that if they were just talking to each other more, it would make our ports more efficient and our supply chains more fluid. And we've signed up a number of partners, including largely from the private sector, dozens now, and are working toward being able to have a prototype of that model up and running this year. It'll be a small dollar amount compared to most of our requests, but I think an investment well spent for exactly the reasons you're raising.
All right. And one of the issues there, because of the port situation, obviously can cause some problems with our rail as well. And is the DOT doing anything to help with the rail situation? I mean, obviously we saw all the news with folks with trains literally parked and people stealing all the items off of them. Has there been anything on that front? And then on top of that, with the rail issue, I mean, we got to the point where we had farmers literally waiting on commodities moving across the country. I've got a large ag district, but a lot of animal agriculture, so chicken, poultry, pork, dairy, beef, waiting on corn, soy, and all the different products that come from the Midwest. And I had truckers running from mill to mill all across the valley, scrambling to get in line to pick up whatever commodity they can find. And it wasn't a simple call. It was you had to show up with a truck, and you've got empty trucks running back and forth, tearing up roads for no purpose just because we weren't able to get those products delivered. And so this rail situation tied with the port just made life miserable for us. And it's gotten a little bit better, but what can we do more?
Yeah, we've been pressing the railroad industry on this, but I believe there's also a public sector role to play that you'll see reflected in the budget request, especially around areas like the CRISI grant program, which we think can contribute to fluidity both in traditional freight rail and in some of these multimodal contexts that require specialized equipment and facilities that can make a big difference in the kinds of contexts that you're describing. Also, I would point to the fact that in addition to being consumers of rail, agriculture producers are more likely to live in communities that are impacted just by quality of life issues like blocked crossings and the safety issues that come with a lot of grade crossings. That's why we're very glad there's a rail crossing elimination program included in IIJA and have been able to use some of our other programs as well to help support projects that would just reduce some of the occasions for that kind of blockage to happen in the first place.
All right, and a quick question. Many cities and counties in my district, and it kind of goes along with what you were just saying, don't have the resources. A lot of smaller communities. I've got some of these communities don't even have city councils. They're just little communities. And they struggle to get the resources together to apply for some of these grants. They're burdensome. There's a lot of regulations. Is there anything that you've done or that you have the ability to do to help alleviate some of these problems, allow these smaller communities to have the access to the same resources as some of the large communities that can afford to have the representation a lot of them have?
Thank you. It's something we think about a lot. We're trying to make sure that our processes are simpler and more straightforward so that you don't have to be a community big enough to have a full-time federal relations person on staff to be able to successfully apply for and win in our programs. And I would point to the proportions of rural projects that we've been able to fund, I think, as evidence of progress here, but I believe there's more that we can do too. A couple areas just briefly to mention. One, something as simple as reducing the page count of our notice of funding opportunities, just having it done with fewer words and fewer pages, I think is emblematic of our effort to make sure that the process is easier to navigate. We're also doing more hands-on technical assistance to help guide communities that maybe haven't been through this experience in the first place through these processes so that they're less opaque, less convoluted, and so those communities are more likely to succeed. Our Routes Council, chaired by the Deputy Secretary, is specifically focused on this, but we're also trying to just work it into the day-to-day work of our various programs.
All right, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I just want to gently remind my colleagues, try not to give the Secretary a question with 10 seconds left, so we can move quickly through and all members can ask their questions. With that, I recognize my good friend, Ms. Watson-Coleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, sir, and thank you so much for visiting our Mercer Trenton Airport. It was a pleasure hosting you, and I know that you got to see exactly what I've been talking to you about an airport that provides services to so many people, not only in 12th Congressional District, my district, even in the state of Pennsylvania and in other counties across the state of New Jersey. I appreciate the fact that you not only saw the desperate need for a new terminal, a new fire station, a new traffic control tower to accommodate the growing demand, but in order for the airport to achieve these goals, they will need help from the federal government in the form of grants and formula funding. Yet my airport is an example of the many more small and mid-sized airports across the country that are too in need of federal assistance. And I was hoping to ask what would happen to airports like the one in my district if federal funding was set back to the 2022 levels for operations, for infrastructure grants to the airports, for the airport terminal program, sir, and for the grants and aids for airports. I know that's a bit much for one question.
Well, I'll do my best to answer
can
it all in
handle it.
one go, though, and appreciate the question because I think it's important to make clear that there would be a real impact here. The Airport Improvement Program formula funds and the allocations of the airport infrastructure grants are based on the employment data for the last full calendar year. So if that's frozen in place, or if the calendar year 22 employments were abnormally low, which is true for a lot of airports, and I think may be the case for Trenton Mercer, which sees a lot of growth in the future but wouldn't be able to book it if they're frozen into that prior level. The consequences that you'd see a reduction both in the entitlements and the allocations. Now there is a best of three provision in the statute for the 22 and 23 allocations, so it tries to do more of a rolling average, but that would expire after fiscal year '23 as well, unless there were an extension. And so that would, both for that AIG and AIP programming, potentially have a very real impact. The better news, I guess, would be that the airport terminal program is a competitive discretionary grant program that doesn't have that same connection to the employment data, but those other sources of funding would very much potentially be impacted.
And our tower program, I mean, you were able to see the site challenge that we had in our control tower.
Yes, and so many towers would be impacted by the kinds of cuts that are being described here. And unfortunately, it would often be at the smaller airports that the cuts would be felt most severely.
So we're really happy to be in what we consider to be the post-pandemic period, and hopefully people get to enjoy vacations and things of that nature. And in my airport, we go to places we like to go on vacation, sunny Florida being one of them. Mr. Secretary, in February, DOT announced the first round investments for the new Reconnecting Communities pilot program, another really exciting and important program. A total of $185 million in grants were awarded to 45 projects across the country to help reconnect these communities that are cut off from opportunity and burdened by past transportation infrastructure decisions. We were able to show you, at least through a presentation, what that Route 29 looks like in terms of cutting Trenton off from its a great resource of the water. I know that several communities in my district are excited to this program, including some in the 12th district, and are working to apply for future opportunities. For FY24, the request comes at $100 million, with $100 million in advance appropriations provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I was hoping if you would share some of the projects that are being funded, why they are being chosen, what impact there will be, and what would happen if that funding were cut as well.
One thing that's been striking in this first of its kind program is the level of demand. In our first year, we got tons of applications in which reflected both construction goals and planning projects to just get communities through that first stage. We had a round of announcements, including, I believe, one in the state of New Jersey, one in New York state that I was able to visit, Buffalo, where they seek to cap the Kensington Express that really is something of a gash through a very important part of the community that community members have been hoping for decades to be able to do something about. There's another example in Florida where an interchange really has had a negative impact on the community but can be addressed and will be now thanks to this funding. There are places in every part of the country, it's not one region, north, south, east, west, where you do have these pieces of infrastructure that have served to divide rather than connect. And I can tell you that there is more than enough demand for all of the funding we're seeking and then some. Cutting it, I think, would leave a lot of communities disappointed.
Thank you very much. I yield back, sir.
Thank you, madam. We'll now go to my good friend from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I know you're working to address the supply chain challenges that are confronting our nation following the pandemic. A lot of those as impacted by aging or limited infrastructure. Our highways, our interstate highway system in particular, needs upgrading, updating. I represent the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, Virginia 6, which stretches from the Roanoke Valley up to Shenandoah Valley and has Interstate 81, which runs along it. I-81 runs from I-40 down to Tennessee to the Canadian border in upstate New York, as you know. But it is the economic backbone of Western Virginia, and it runs over 300 miles in both Virginia 6 and Virginia 9 and Southwest Virginia. It is not just a transportation corridor for goods and services from points south, Mexico, and otherwise to points north, New York and New England, but it's also a major corridor for local farmers, for families, for small businesses. It really is truly the backbone of the valley. For many years, we have all agreed on both sides of the aisle, along with my colleague from Northern Virginia, Congresswoman Wexton, and also Senators Warner and Kane, that I-81 does need a third lane. And it was built originally for 15% trucking capacity, but often operates with 30, maybe upwards of 50, depending on the time of day, trucking capacity or percentage of trucks. It's the most dangerous highway in Virginia with over 2,000 crashes and millions of hours of delays yearly. So the Commonwealth has adopted a corridor improvement plan, but the timeline is challenging. And so I would just ask that as you consider resources and allocating those resources nationally to address the supply chain issues, congestion issues, that you look at the bottleneck that's being created by I-81 in the valley only being 2 lanes, and hopefully there are opportunities within the department to make the interstate safer and run more efficiently.
Well, thank you. I'm aware of this corridor improvement plan. I believe there are 64 different projects that are encompassed within it, and know that that's going to be a big lift. I'm aware that the state has put forward a lot of resources, and we're glad that the increased formula dollars that come with the infrastructure law are part of the mix of funding available for that. But certainly would also note that there are a number of discretionary programs that we have that might also come into play for many of the projects that are part of that broader vision, and certainly an area that we're very much aware of as we're doing our work.
Thank you very much. Let's see. I wanted to also ask about the livestock industry, which is important in the valley. The livestock industry has been exempted from the ELD mandate, electronic logging devices, for the last 5 years. Meanwhile, statistics through the trucking industry as a whole show that ELDs have in fact reduced safety on the roads as drivers are speeding to beat the clock. How do you respond to the fact that the ELD implementation may have led to less safe roadways in some areas?
Well, the idea of ELDs is to make sure that drivers do not drive longer than they safely can, leading to fatigue, which we know is a major cause of crashes. Certainly, if there is an attempt to defeat or work around that, that could lead to an unsafe condition. I don't believe the solution is to abandon our work to reduce fatigue. But I do believe that there are a number of steps that we can take that are part of a broader safe systems approach that will make a difference in conjunction with the work we do around hours of service. And just one example that I would mention is the availability of truck parking. We know one thing that creates a lot of pressure on drivers is as they get close to timing out on their hours of service, they're not sure if there's going to be a safe, let alone convenient place to park between now and then. It's one of the reasons why we are encouraging states to use eligible formula dollars to fund truck parking and using some of our own discretionary dollars, most recently in projects in Florida and in Tennessee, to directly construct more truck parking, because that shortage is real and an issue we hear a lot about.
If we have any
from
left
drivers.
over after that 3rd lane gets constructed, we'll put some more parking on there too.
Maybe they could go together.
One more question. Truckers and independent operators from my district have expressed concern with the FMCSA's proposed rule for heavy vehicle speed limiters. Time and again, data suggests that it's a complicated factor about the causation of truck passenger accidents, not to mention that the rule could be particularly harmful to small business owners. Does DOT think implementing this rule will be specifically harmful to independent owner-operators, and how did DOT decide on the suggested 60-mile-per-hour maximum?
I'd asked you, Mr. Secretary, to be short. You're kind of violating my
Sorry,
rule
Mr.
there,
Chairman.
Mr.
Okay.
Klein. He didn't give the Secretary the time.
Well, the short answer is safety is our North Star. We'll be guided by the data, and we welcome stakeholder and industry input as we're working toward finalization of rules.
Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize my good friend from California, Representative Torres, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary, it's really great to see you. I hope the family is doing great. On behalf of my constituents, I want to thank you and your staff for all of the assistance that you have provided, that they have provided to the Inland Empire, the district that I represent, in the short time that you have been the Secretary of Transportation. Thank you for the RACE grant. You came out last September and saw the challenges that we have in our district. You know, if we want to talk about the Inland Empire, it really encompasses my colleague, Representative Aguilar's district also. I represent the bulk of the freight corridor. We have one international airport where UPS has its second largest hub. We have 3 smaller executive airports, for lack of a better word. And we have three major freeways where trucks, compete and dominate on most days. We really need your help. And I know that you have given so much, and your staff has given so much, but I would like to ask of you here to help us figure out, maybe there's a pilot program out there that we can work through where we can get technical assistance to deal with some of the issues related to the freight corridor that I represent. While the Port of LA and Long Beach are extremely important, and I would like to just remind you that 40% of all containerized imports come through the Port of LA and Long Beach, and 30% of all exports go through those two same ports. Pretty much all of that comes through my district first, by either rail. The Alameda Corridor splits my district in half, which causes other problems because we have no over or underpasses. I can't say no, very few overpasses to deal with emergency vehicles that need to get from one side to the other to help people in need. So we have experienced the worst air pollution. We continue to experience that even through the COVID period, where our commuters were grounded, working from home. We still had the worst air pollution in California was centered in my district. We had 177 ozone days. So we really need help to figure out how do we, we're not looking to shut down any port. We're not looking to shut down commerce. We are looking for assistance and some relief. You saw some of that with children, challenging streets where children had to compete with truckers, to walk from their home neighborhood to their high school or middle school. So I think that you get some of our challenges. I just want to ask you, with the cuts that Republicans are right now, trying to reduce our budget. This budget, the infrastructure bill, communities like mine simply cannot do without your help. And a 20% reduction to your team would have, critical impacts negative impacts in my district.
Well, thanks for the question, and I will never forget during my visit to your and Representative Aguilar's district, seeing that passageway that the students of Etiwanda High School have to walk under without a sidewalk, let alone, or even a gutter, let alone a sidewalk, on their way to school. And of course, we're proud to be supporting changes to that corridor. The broader issue you're speaking about is one that implicates both economic security, because we need those supply chains to be strong, and justice, because the people who live along those supply chains shouldn't have negative health consequences just because so many goods pass through their neighborhoods in their area. This is a good example, I think, of what it means when we talk about how we use taxpayer dollars to make our country better off. Programs like the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Formula Grant Program, we've got $2.6 billion programmed for that for fiscal '24. The Carbon Reduction Program, which was created by the infrastructure law, which reduces not just carbon, but I think also other harmful pollutants often will be reduced too. And strongly believe that we need to be doing more, not less right now, especially because one of the challenges of our time is to accommodate and encourage a higher volume of throughput in terms of our goods,
Yes.
without that leading to a higher volume of burden and pollution that would come with it.
I know that you have two young babies, and I hate to add, more to your travel agenda, especially since you already visited our district. But I want to ask for you to send a team of your staff to work with us. I would like to have a roundtable that would include the governor's office, because they are looking to pass bills for buffer zones. So if buffer zone areas are created, it's going to kill how goods movement, flows through the region. So we need to work together. I apologize to the chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. We next go to our good friend from Arizona, Mr. Sistamani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Secretary, for being here with us today. As you know, in my home state of Arizona, Interstate 10 connects our main cities of Phoenix and Tucson, and it serves as a critical artery for many individuals who frequently travel back and forth for work, for pleasure, for tourism. It's also key for security and more. And as our state has grown exponentially, so has the need for an expansion of the I-10. This interstate serves as a major corridor for our state and our region, facilitating international trade and commerce as well, but it's become a dangerous portion of the highway with only 2 lanes in each direction and creating a bottleneck. So every time I go home, I hear from my constituents about their growing frustrations with the worsening traffic on the highway and the dozens of accidents occurring due to a lack of proper infrastructure. A few months ago, I was disappointed when this administration denied my state's mega grant application for an expansion of the I-10. And on December 16th, 2021, the Federal Highway Administration, an agency within the Department of Transportation, of course, issued a policy memo encouraging states to prioritize using Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act formula funds for road and bridge repair over capacity expansion. This memo has since been rescinded, prioritized the implementation of partisan policies and disregarded congressional intent. So can you please tell me about how the Department of Transportation is prioritizing infrastructure project grants and how Arizona can be more competitive moving forward?
Well, first of all, let me make clear that we recognize there's no one-size-fits-all policy. While we want to make sure that transportation policy and choices reflect things that America has learned over the years, including the effects of highway expansion on induced demand and the fact that sometimes it is not the solution that it seems to be. It's also certainly still the case that there are places where expansion is called for, and often the places where that is most likely to be called for are in high-growth areas like what we see in Arizona and the West. And in any case, as both iterations of our federal highway guidance made clear, with regard to formula dollars, these decisions are up to the states. In terms of the application you referenced, I do want to make sure it's well understood that we received far more excellent applications for the mega program than we could fund. We were able to say yes to approximately 4% of the funding, which meant, of course, 96% worth of the applicants went away disappointed because we had about $20 billion of applications for about $1 billion of funding. However, of course, that was only the first year of the program, and that's only one of many programs. And so you have my commitment that if we haven't already, our team will get together with the project sponsors for that I-10 application and make sure that they know everything that would be useful to them in making their application as strong and competitive as possible, both for future rounds of MEGA and potentially other programs that it might qualify for.
I do have one more question, but before that, I want to just say that looking at the fiscal year 23 grants, it seems that most of the projects that you're referring to that receive the mega grants incorporate bicycle, pedestrian, or transit infrastructure. So I just want to ensure that DOT isn't letting a political agenda prevent states like mine from receiving much-needed grants. So to my question, according to your budget, DOT expects to pay about $70 million for rent and utilities in fiscal year 2024, in addition to expenses for maintenance and repairs of its headquarters. Given your current telework policy and the 20% office vacancy rate in D.C., I have concerns that this world-class space is not being utilized by 5,000 DOT headquarters staff. What is your headquarters building current capacity rate, and how does that compare to what it was before the pandemic?
So without having the numbers off the top of my head, it is certainly the case that there are fewer people in the building any given day than there were pre-pandemic. And while I would note that the majority of our workers across US DOT are in work environments from truck inspection facilities to air traffic control settings where remote work is not an option, for the office jobs, telework has become an important dimension of how they work. And while I think we still have not seen the final version of what the new normal will be like for office work in general and for federal office work in particular, I believe it is likely that there will be substantial taxpayer savings from right-sizing our office footprint to reflect some of the gains in efficiency that might come from more flexible patterns, things like reservation systems for spaces. And there's a modest but meaningful part of our budget request, about $6 million for things like procuring a system to manage that and digitally mapping our spaces so that if we're not just going back to the way things were in 2019, we're seeing taxpayer savings along the way from more efficient use of the space we do have.
Well, thank you. I have more on this, but I'll save it for round two. I don't want to get in trouble with the chairman. I'm already sitting in the unique spot down here. I don't want to get into more trouble. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
We can find more unique spots if we need to. But, you're
I'm okay
very-
with this one. I'm
gentleman's
happy.
Very wise.
Happy to
very
be
wise.
here.
With that, let me go to my friend from New York, Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Secretary, thank you for your service, your commitment to our infrastructure, to transportation. Certainly, our country needed much more than just a facelift. It needed a major investment, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act provided $1.2 trillion to do just that. And last time such a big investment was made was back in 1956. I don't think you were born there, but it was $25 billion that the Eisenhower administration provided to increase from 7,000 to 41,000 miles of road across the highways across the country. But this does so much more. I mean, this is really a major investment, and I think it's going to be a phenomenal job producer and motivator for our economy. And I also want to thank you for your budget, which includes $2.9 billion for capital investment. And in there, there's an important project, Mr. Chairman, in my district, which is the 2nd Avenue subway. We could build a subway still in our country, and that will address many needs in a transportation desert and will connect East Harlem and Harlem to the rest of the world. My question is, Secretary, your budget requests $59 million for cross-cutting research and development to advance new technologies and practices to improve railroad safety and efficiency. What are some of the new technologies in the works to improve railroad safety? Could you complete these necessary improvements with nearly a 20% cut? I mean, if we're having these rail safety issues, what will the cut mean regarding that?
Well, thank you for the question. And whether we're talking about enforcement or whether we're talking about research, I believe this is the wrong time to be cutting railroad safety investments. The kind of work that we propose to do, I think, could make a real and lasting difference in operating improvements as well as safety improvements on our rails. Some of the things that are in view of the FRA's research and development program include further refining autonomous track geometry systems and rail integrity systems. They use ultrasound to help identify rail flaws that might not be visible to the naked eye. There would be standards and specifications for the next generation of positive train control systems. We're hearing a lot about development on the surface road side, but also intelligent rail systems that could make grade crossing safer or prevent trespass are something that we could do a lot of good work on. Anything and everything that could be used to prevent a crash, a derailment, an accident is something that we want to make sure we're investing these R&D dollars to help with, and we would like to see more, not less, go toward that, especially at this time when the country's eyes have been opened to the frequency of derailments and other rail accidents in this country.
Thank you. I think that's critically important, and I hope that we can avert that crisis. Finally, I'm going to make a statement. I always tell my colleagues that I have the largest parking lot in the entire country. It's called the Cross Bronx Expressway. And gridlock there often every day turns it into a parking lot. And so we're working to cap it, Mr. Secretary. I'm working with Congressman Richie Torres for that. Robert Moses, the infamous Robert Moses, so like divided the Bronx into the South Bronx and North Bronx with the Cross Bronx Expressway. But that's a little stretch, and not many people know about that. Connect the Cross Bronx Expressway to the George Washington Bridge, and that's called the Trans-Manhattan Expressway. I would like perhaps to that be considered also. It's a very small, less than a mile perhaps, but stretch, but important as well. And I would like for that to be considered in the studies and the work in capping that infamous parking lot that I have in my district, the Cross Bronx Expressway.
We'd welcome a chance to work with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Just as a housekeeping matter, I want to advise the members, we're going to make sure everybody gets a first question, so we have 2 more members to go, but we will bring the hearing to a close just for time consideration out of respect for the Secretary. And I know a lot of us have travel needs as well. So only 2 more questions and then final statements by the ranking member and myself. With that, I recognize my very good friend from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and prayers for the Cole, Oklahoma region, devastated by a tornado last night. Mr. Secretary, I too want to kind of put my name on the same question that came up earlier about the discretionary grant applications and the tremendous cost. Small communities that just don't have the resources that bigger communities have. Just in no response necessary, but just hear it from us. We have the same concerns that was voiced earlier. As much as $170,000 or hundreds of man-hours engaged in outside consulting firms to be able to demonstrate qualification for these projects, and we want the department to be aware of that. I have an FTA, Federal Transit Administration issue, requesting the ability to use urbanized area formula and additional fixed highway trust funds for large transit agency operating expense shortfalls. Essentially requesting the ability to use federal funds to cover ridership shortfalls. And we know that this happened during the pandemic, but now coming out of the pandemic, we need to get away from the pandemic mindset, as I call it. Even as the President acknowledges that the public health emergency is over. According to the American Public Transportation Association, subway and commuter rail ridership was 62% of pre-pandemic levels in Q4 of 2022. And I don't think anybody with a straight face can project that ridership is going to reach pre-pandemic levels. And don't take it from me, but in November of last year, heads of 15 of the largest transit agencies sent a letter to you acknowledging that ridership would not return to pre-pandemic levels. So this begs the question, will this temporary assistance become another federal entitlement? Congress didn't intend urbanized area formula funds to be used for operating expenses. It was not an oversight. It's recognition that a transit agency should rely on ridership to fund their operations, which I personally think is a reasonable requirement. Frankly, many of my constituents in Arkansas think that way too much money goes to the big city transit agencies, and this proposal would only increase that amount. So, Mr. Secretary, if Congress granted you this authority, how would you ensure that this is a temporary program?
We do want to make sure that cities and states recognize that we still expect them to make appropriate investments in transit. We also know that transit yields major economic benefits. For every dollar invested in transit, there's about $5 of economic growth that come with it. And many transit agencies have continued to face fiscal issues, which we think are acute and we believe are not permanent, but are not resolving just in a year or two as post-COVID commuting patterns continue to evolve in the country. The main thing I'd emphasize here is that this is a form of flexibility, not a requirement from us. So we're trying to make sure that the transit agencies have what they need to head off any kind of fiscal cliff that could leave commuters high and dry, and at the same time are not viewing this as anything short of a measure to help bridge through that period. And of course, with this or anything else we do are going to make sure we're staying within the lines of the law as written.
Okay. Last question is about the contract tower program. I have 4 airports in my district that use this very successful public-private partnership, and I believe it enhances aviation safety. I think it's well documented. It's effective. It's cost-effective. Contract towers handle about 29% of all U.S. tower operations, but about 10% of the overall budget. So I think it's a pretty good bang for the buck. I'm concerned about how the changes proposed in the FAA's recent market survey announcement for the contract tower program will affect aviation safety and program costs. I'm worried that we're introducing unnecessary risk into this successful program at a time when we're seeing historic air traffic control staffing shortages. So, Mr. Secretary, can you, in the remaining time, 40 seconds we have, can you help me understand how you will evaluate the risk of fundamentally changing the contract tower program versus any projected cost savings?
Well, to be clear, we are calling for a budget request that will fully fund all towers participating in the program, $194 million, in addition to putting to use the $20 million provided for airport-owned federal contract towers to be able to make improvements or changes that need to happen there. These are subject to benefit cost calculations. We also recognize the unique situations and distortions that have occurred across the aviation sector in recent years. And anything that we seek to do moving forward will be in the spirit of refining and improving the program, but in a way that we want to make sure works for the airports and the communities concerned.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your service to our country, and as a former mayor, you get a lot of these issues that we're
Indeed.
broaching with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you. We'll go to our last question of the day. My good friend, the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Wexton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I take note of the fact that I am the last question of the day, so I'll try to move it along as best I can. Also, I want to tell you, I kind of like having my own little table down here. It's nice to be alone down here and just have a little room to spread out. It's very nice, so I don't mind. And Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you again as well. And for the first time since I've joined the subcommittee, I'm very pleased that I'm not going to be inviting you to the grand opening of the Silver Line Phase 2. It opened in November. We were very delighted to have you there. Thank you so much for coming. It would have been really embarrassing if I invited you twice and you hadn't shown up, so thank you.
It was a pleasure to be there. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would like, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the Leesburg Airport. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not. The Leesburg Airport was one of very few airports that participated in the remote tower program, but it was actually a remote tower that was operated. It was entirely remote, so there was no tower there at the airport. As you know, earlier this year, the decision was made to stop pursuing qualification for the remote tower technology that had been used at Leesburg Airport for several years. I also won't be surprised to hear that because Leesburg was untowered before it got the remote tower, it did pick up an awful lot of traffic during that period of time, and it was really good for the airport and also for the very region. So it's very, very concerned about what will happen if we stop if it suddenly becomes untowered without any other solution. I appreciate FAA's, and understand that Leesburg and FAA are having productive talks about the path forward, and we don't have the safety risks that would come from making it stop altogether. So I appreciate that they're working together to come up with a contract tower program in 2020, construction of a physical tower. I look forward to discussing with this more detail with Administrator Nolan next week. I want to know now, I want to ask you now, can we count on the commitment of the department to assure us of the continuity of air traffic control services beyond FY23 at Leesburg Executive Airport as it transitions from a remote tower to a more permanent solution?
Well, thank you. I know that FAA has been closely coordinating with the city and the airport when it comes to the importance of making sure that safe operations continue. As you noted, and my understanding is the same, that there is a plan to build a brick and mortar physical tower, and Leesburg has been accepted into the federal contract tower program. My understanding is there's a discussion right now about how it might be possible to use a mobile tower as an interim solution to maintain those separation services. And you have my commitment that we'll continue to be in good dialogue and work with the city and the airport to find solutions that are going to maintain safety and support operations there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Glad to hear that. And it's still going to be nicer than the tower at Manassas Airport. But we'll talk about that next time for us. Union Station, I would like to talk to you a little bit about that. As you know, we're doing a lot of real expansion work in Virginia. One of several key projects which will unlock the rail network is the Union Station expansion project. It's over a century old and unfortunately desperately needs safety, security, and accessibility improvements. Union Station is right here. It's very close to the Capitol. It serves a lot of the folks here in the area. A lot of folks take the metro station there to come into work every day. I'm concerned by the slow pace of progress made by DOT and FRA on the implementation of the project. It's been nearly a decade since the environmental review of this project began. Over 2 years since FRA released the environmental impact statement. Union Station is the only station in the country owned by DOT. You know that, right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful station. It needs some facelift. Federal government has a responsibility to ensure that Union Station is maintained and expanded to meet the needs of the public. Do you agree that the completion of this project is of significant importance to both the regional and national interests?
Union Station is certainly a very important facility, both for commuters and for intracity travel. And we're pleased to see that there is effective leadership with the newly organized Union Station Development Corporation, and
what-
certainly
what's-
agree
what's
that their
the- what's
success
the-
is
Can you
important.
tell us what steps the department is taking to ensure that the record of decision will be completed within the calendar year?
I'd have to check on the latest status of the environmental process, but certainly something that we're watching closely. I visited the site last year, and our deputy secretary was there recently. I think that in addition to the environmental process, it'll of course be necessary to identify appropriate sources for funds, and we've been in touch with the mayor and others about the visions for how to do that.
Very good. Hopefully the record of decision will be completed by the end of the year.
That I would have to get back to you on.
Very good. And so you want to talk a little bit about the use of Merchant Marine Academy? I've had the pleasure of recommending of nominating five students there. And it's a great school. It's one of the service academies that is kind of a little best kept secret among them. If people can get out of the Merchant Marine Academy, they can join the Navy, they can join the Merchant Marine, they can they can write their own ticket. But it made me very sad to see that the individuals from the 10th district who are attending there sent us pictures of what the facilities there look like. The conditions are well beyond what anybody would expect from an institution, let alone one of our nation's top 5 service academies. I'm concerned that these conditions would hinder our ability to attract a diverse pool of young men and women needed for our American military sea lift. And it's terrible conditions there. I think, have you ever visited Merchant Marine Academy? You had an opportunity to visit there?
Yes, twice.
And did you concur that it needs some love from TLC?
Yeah, like you, I share the view that it's one of the underappreciated gems of our transportation system. And yes, and I'll emphasize that our budget request includes a robust request for physical capital improvements because they're very much needed for student quality of life and for the durability of the facilities there.
You sure this work will be overseen by a final question, Mr. Cool?
We're out of time.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back. I'll ask the question off the record.
Thank you very much. I now go to my very good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Quigley, for any closing remarks he cares to make.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for handling a complicated hearing during votes and getting everybody home on time. Mr. Secretary, earlier you were referencing Dickens, that this is indeed for transportation the best of times and the worst of times. Clearly, the problems and challenges are extraordinary, but the opportunities are great. The infrastructure bill is just part of that, but it is up to us to continue to move forward because those opportunities are essential to compete on a worldwide market and to keep our people safe. So thank you for taking on this job. As I referenced when you took it, to the spoils go the victor, but we're glad you're doing it. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I thank my friend, Mr. Secretary. I want to join the ranking member. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your testimony, which as usual was full and forthcoming and direct and very much appreciated. To my friends on the other side of the aisle who were concerned about cuts, I'm going to echo a quote that I used at our last secretarial meeting. We don't have our final number yet, so it may be better than you think. It may be just as bad as you think, or it could be worse than you think. The one thing I will guarantee you, you won't be happy with it, whatever it is. So that's fair enough. But I also take the opportunity to remind my friends, we're in an extraordinary inflationary cycle, the worst in over 40 years. Most economists agree that was kicked off by the American Rescue Plan. I would argue that the Inflation Reduction Act was probably the most misnamed piece of legislation in history because it was basically a climate change bill. You can be for it or against it, but it didn't help with inflation. It accelerated that problem. And we're dealing with that now, partly by restraining spending, but the Federal Reserve obviously is raising interest rates, which I know complicates your life, Mr. Secretary, but much more important to all of us. It complicates the life of every single American. Nothing tougher on families than inflation. And the lower your income, the worse problem it is for you. So that's the consequence, we think, of overspending, and we're going to do some things about that. But you also have my commitment. We're going to work with you, particularly in the safety areas. We share your concerns and appreciate your efforts in that regard. I don't know any politicians, Republican or Democrat, that don't like to build roads and don't think infrastructure is a worthy investment. So we're going to do as much as we can within the confines of the number we're finally given to work with you and your department, certainly to work with my friends on both sides of the aisle, all of whom have legitimate local concerns and all of whom care very deeply about the national transportation infrastructure and what we can do to make it better. So again, Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. Thank you for being here. I look forward to working with you in the weeks and months ahead. And with that, the hearing's adjourned.